So, you want to save the world with clean energy? Make money doing it? Confused about the economic and technical realities of residential and commercial solar, batteries, heat pumps, EVs? Want the real-world scoop on new energy technologies, not manufacturer hype? Then tune in to the Weekly Energy Show, hosted by Barry Cinnamon. Insights from Barry's 40-plus years in the solar and energy industry will help you understand the future ways we'll generate and consume energy. And now, here's Barry.
Welcome to this week's Energy Show. Now, the general consensus is that there is a climate emergency, global warming, global climate change, whatever you want to call it. It looks like it's happening. Now, candidly, there's still not 100% consensus of the problem, of the cause, and the solutions. But, we're in the upper 90s as far as people and scientists and politicians who think that there's a big problem there. So if there is an emergency, and for people who don't believe in man-made climate change, you don't have to listen to the show. But if there is an emergency, what can we do about it? Well, this week we're going to be talking about something called Project Drawdown. Now, it's a plan to reverse the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. Not just slow down the emissions, but reverse the trend of these emissions so that we can reverse global warming. We're over 400 parts per billion of CO2 in the atmosphere right now. It used to be 100. So we're looking at somehow getting that number down by lower emissions. And also, there's other things like sequestration that we can do. So the key to this Project Drawdown is finding a way to reduce every source of CO2 in the atmosphere so that gradually the concentration in the atmosphere is reduced. Now, there's all kinds of other issues about, are we at a tipping point and is this going to accelerate? Is it going to go a straight line? Are there going to be other sources of emissions like melting permafrost, or the warmer oceans are going to be releasing more dissolved CO2? I'm not really sure about that. Those are other big problems. But really, the fundamental focus of Project Drawdown is, how can we reverse global warming? And this effort was led by a couple of environmentalists, Paul Hawken and Amanda Joy Ravenhill. And they said, let's try and figure this out. And they just didn't figure it out themselves. They put together a team of over 200 scholars, scientists, policymakers, business leaders, and activists worldwide to basically assess and map and model the most substantive solutions that we can use to reduce global warming, reduce the impact of global warming, reduce those CO2 emissions. And the results of the study were published in 2017. There's a book called Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reduce global warming. Now, the challenge is it's a plan, and they've come up with 80 documented solutions to do this. It's not just one thing. You can't just do one thing. And there's 80 things that they looked at, not one silver bullet, but they looked at a lot of things. And not only things like solar and plant-based diets, but some less intuitive things, and we'll go into that. So the framework they use is a good framework. They rank the solutions by the amount of CO2 reduction that could be accomplished by each solution, like better land use or plant-based diets or utility-scale solar. They looked at how much CO2 would be reduced by those measures, and they measured the reductions in terms of gigatons of CO2. A gigaton is 1 billion tons of CO2. That's a lot. So not only did they look at the amount of CO2 that could be reduced, but they also looked at the total costs of these solutions over 30 years. So, for example, things like solar and wind turbines, they looked at how much they could reduce the CO2, but then they also looked at how much it would cost to put in enough wind turbines and solar panels to accomplish those reductions. And then they looked at the total savings over 30 years. How much cheaper would the electricity be if electricity were generated by wind and solar than conventional energy generation? And, so in many cases for these solutions, there's actually savings. So although it may be expensive, you're going to see some cost savings. Obviously, there's a challenge because you have a tug of war between industries. Some industries are going to have to shift, and incumbent industries aren't going to kind of just stand back and say, hey, like the coal industry, hey, we don't need any more coal. We just want more wind and solar. That's not going to happen easily, but you're going to see some savings. So The results of all these solutions, they looked at 80. I don't know why they came up with 80, but these were based on their analysis, the 80 most practical comprehensive solutions. They looked at them over 30 years. And over 30 years, it would reduce the CO2 by 1,034 gigatons by 2050, so it's 30 years, cost $29 trillion, and it would save $74 trillion. Now, this is kind of a summary of a lot of little, 80 different activities, 80 different solutions, and these solutions are all over the map. So it's not like these are totally scientifically engineered, totally budgeted solutions. There's some flexibility that's going to happen there, and these numbers aren't super firm, but it's a really, really good start. So I thought it would be good just to kind of look at the top 10 solutions that they ranked, and they ranked them based on the amount of atmospheric CO2 that can be reduced. Some of these are obvious. Some of them are like, what the heck? So when you look at this list from 80, the 80 options, and I'm just looking at the top 10 right now. Number 1 is refrigerant management. Now, that's not just taking good care of everybody's refrigerator. Basically, this means that they're preventing old refrigerants. These are HFCs, halogen fluorocarbons. That's like what the coolant or the refrigerant that's used in a refrigerator. It's compressed, it gets hot, then when it expands, it gets cold, so that refrigerates things. Run it in reverse, you can use a heat pump. But the number one saving is preventing old refrigerants from going into the atmosphere. So basically, when that refrigerator that you're sick and tired of gets thrown into the dump, and then, it's crushed, and the HFC, the fluorocarbons, escape from that. Those fluorocarbons are 1,000 times worse than CO2 for global warming. It's really, really bad. They're manufactured they're man-made, so it's an industrial process. But when they escape, when those old cars with air conditioners are scrapped, you got that car air conditioner, those refrigerants get in the atmosphere. So number 1 is to manage those old refrigerants. When you're scrapping your car, you suck that refrigerant out of the air conditioner, and then it can be destroyed or, maybe even possibly reused. But it can be burned, it can be destroyed in a way that's not going to be terribly worse for the environment. So that was number 1. Boy, that was a surprise. All right. And what's also interesting about this is we're looking at what the savings are. In this case, there's a net cost because we have to really change the process by which we're avoiding these refrigerants from escaping into the atmosphere. So this one has a $900 billion cost, $902 billion over 30 years. That's because every junkyard, every dump, every recycled piece of refrigeration equipment would have to go through some kind of recycling process of the refrigerant. Yeah, scrap the metal, melt it down, but you got to get that refrigerant out. Okay. Number 2, big solution, onshore wind turbines. Wind is probably the cheapest way. I mean, wind and utility scale wind and utility scale solar, cheapest way to generate electricity. So that's number 2 on the list. It would reduce the atmospheric CO2 by 84.6 gigatons, billion tons. And it has a pretty good net savings. So the cost is about $1,225 billion. So it's $1.2 trillion, and it would have a savings of $7.4 trillion. That's pretty good. So that's an obvious one. All right. Number 3, there's another one that's kind of bizarre. You don't really expect it. Reducing food waste. A third of the food that's produced, the third of the food that we grow, or the third of the meat that comes off of the animals that we grow for food, a third of it is wasted. It's thrown out. It's discarded even during production. You might have a crooked carrot, and that's not going to fit into one of those bags at the supermarket. So they throw those out. So by avoiding a third of the food waste, basically we can improve the efficiency of our whole food chain, of our agriculture. And that's going to save quite a bit. That's going to save 70.5 gigatons of CO2. Now, the cost and the savings for that, the Project Drawdown really wasn't able to evaluate that because we don't know how we're going to do it. These are some of the things that worry me. When we don't really have a number on it, it means we haven't really figured out how to do it yet. So these are kind of questionable things. Okay. Number 4, a plant-rich diet. So basically we're talking about, more a vegetarian diet as opposed to a vegetarian and a meat diet. A fifth of the emissions are caused by our meat-based diets. Now, I'm not exactly sure where some of these numbers come from, but that 20% of the emissions out there are caused by the fact that we've got an agricultural system that's designed around raising cows and poultry and pigs and things like, and maybe even fish. So by avoiding those industries, by basically having the protein and the calories in the grain and then the crops that we raise be consumed directly instead of going into an animal and then we're slaughtering the animal for food. We use tremendously less fossil fuel energy than we are for just, having a pure plant-based diet. So the advantage is less energy for plant-based diets because the grain, the beans, it's consumed directly by human beings instead of those grains and beans and corn going into the animals, and then the animals have to consume that, they have to grow, and then we're having that protein from there. So that's a pretty significant one. 66 gigatons of CO2 would be saved. And once again, we're not exactly sure how we're going to do that. So there's no real dollar amount to implement that or the savings. We don't know what that is yet. Okay. Number 5, tropical forests. By eliminating the destruction of tropical forests, by eliminating burning forests, kind of keeping the carbon in the trees, we're able to save quite a bit. It's much better than actually growing certain crops. So what we really want to do is, instead of burning forests, we want to have more forests because the forests are absorbing CO2. It stays in the leaves in the wood. And also the trees are also absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere and turning that into the structure of the tree. And they're also generating oxygen. So that's all good. So that was number 5. Number 6. Number 6 and 7 are kind of interesting. Number 6 is educating girls to reduce population growth. And this is kind of focused on women and girls. And number 7 is family planning for women and girls. So both of these are directed towards the possibility or the approach of reducing population and getting more women into the workforce so that they're basically, these people are a tremendous resource and they're going to be more productive. So it's a reducing population growth and really improving the efficiency or productivity of our society. All right, number 8, solar farms. That one's obvious. I'm glad that solar made it onto the top 10. Solar farms for utility power generation. Utility scale solar is one of the cheapest way, along with wind, to generate electricity. It's going to save about 37 gigatons of carbon dioxide. And this is kind of interesting. It's got a really good payback. It's actually a negative cost. In other words, it's cheaper to build these plants than it is to build fossil fuel plants, and then you're looking at a $5 trillion savings. Number 10 is rooftop solar. I skipped over number 9, but rooftop solar is very similar. It's a really cheap way of generating electricity. It's obvious. It's easy to implement. It's very cost effective. Once again, we've got really good savings there. Not quite as much savings as utility scale solar farms. 24.6 gigatons with rooftop solar compared to 37 gigatons with solar farms, but still pretty substantial. All right, I skipped over number 9. It's one of those kind of, what the heck? What is this called? It's called silvopasture. Now, silvopasture is an ancient practice that integrates trees and pastures into a single system for raising livestock. So one way of looking at this is just kind of imagine, instead of cows grazing over big ranch lands and fields, the cows are grazing where there's trees. So you got trees are sequestering carbon. That's really good. It's an old practice. It's not something that we've adopted recently, but it does change. If we are able to change the way we raise livestock, it can be a pretty significant savings. Okay, we talked about the top 10. Now, what about some of the more obvious and popular solutions that you might have thought about that would be higher in the list, but they're really not that high in the list? So I'm just going to kind of dig into, the items 11 through 80 on the list. A bunch of them are on the electricity generation side. There's geothermal power, which is number 18 on the list. It's a good idea. It provides power baseload, so it cranks nighttime and daytime. But it's more expensive than wind and solar, and it's really tough to site. I mean, you need certain locations. It's not going to be close into where people live. It's going to be in remote, geologically active volcano areas. So it's not going to work everywhere. Nuclear energy generation, nuclear electricity generation. No brainer. We've been doing it for 50 years. Lots of potential, but it's once again more expensive than some of the renewables. And the impediment really is it's not socially or economically feasible in many locations. We've been trying to build nuclear power plants here in the U.S. Nothing's gone in like the last 20 years. We're almost ready for the first couple. And meanwhile, we're retiring a lot of plants. Why? Because they're just not that economically feasible anymore. All right, 22. Offshore wind turbines. Now, you're accustomed and familiar with the wind turbines that are going on in windy areas onshore, in valleys, near mountains where there's a lot of steady wind. Well, there's a lot of steady wind offshore also. The tricky thing about offshore wind generation is we haven't really gotten it down in price that much. It's really expensive. It's expensive to get the power from 10 miles off the coast or 5 miles off the coast into the coastal areas. And it's just, these systems are just a lot more expensive. So that hasn't taken off so fast. All right, number 25, concentrated solar. This was really big 15 years ago. But because the price of regular solar panels has come down so much and we have a lot of land, the need to concentrate these solar plants, make a smaller geographic footprint where we're generating more power, it's just not there, and it's just not really taken off as much. All right. Here's one that kind of surprised me, number 26, electric vehicles. I was surprised that this wasn't higher in the transportation category. The reason why it wasn't higher is the analysis assumed that worldwide electric vehicle ownership would be 16% in 2050. Now, that was the assumption they made, and I think car manufacturers weren't really fully behind this 3 years ago or so when this plan was really put together. But now I see that the trend is a lot faster. The battery costs are continuing to be reduced very quickly. The car costs are lower. So, when you look at a cheaper car to manufacture, not as many moving parts, and then you got lower battery costs, they're high now, but they're coming down. It means that they're going to be more affordable. There's also going to be a better charging infrastructure. That's all still going in. And the car companies are on board. So I fully expect that the whole concept of using, this applies also for trucks also, but it's going to move up in terms of the list because we are emitting a lot of greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels for transportation, for cars, for trucks, also for ships and planes, which kind of leads me to a couple of the next one. Ships. We can reduce the greenhouse gases from ships, not by using a different fuel, because really you need a really concentrated fuel to get that ship from one continent to another. And sails, not a good option. I mean, that was okay in the 18th century, but not in the 21st century. So we're looking at improvements in ships, and the reason why it's number 32 on the list is because these are efficiency improvements. These are better engines, more streamlined ships, less air resistance, and really doing everything we can to kind of make those ships move from continent to continent without as much fuel. Trucks, kind of the same thing, but I'm putting trucks in the same category as electric vehicles. I'm pretty confident that we'll be seeing more and more electrified truck transportation as companies are announcing both pickup trucks and long-haul trucks that are electric. Pickup trucks I can see because, in delivery trucks, the postal service, things like that. The long-haul trucks are going to be tricky to do because, you need a lot of fuel density once again. And if you want to dedicate a quarter of the payload of the truck to a battery, that ends up being pretty expensive to kind of haul around. But we're going to see progress on that. Worldwide, road freight accounts for 6% of emissions. They're going to be more efficient, just fundamentally more efficient, and I'm pretty confident that they're going to be electrified. Airplanes, I'm kind of coming back to the transportation category. That's number 43. The carbon reduction that we're looking at airplanes, 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide, it's not going to happen by making these things electric. That's kind of far away, I think. Conceptually, we can do it, and there's some tests out there, but we're far away. It's really making the airplanes more efficient, the jets more efficient. Better engines, better combustion processes. Maybe they go a little bit slower. We don't have the Concorde anymore. Burned an incredible amount of fuel, but that's going to improve. All right. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things that go on in buildings. We're talking about solar hot water systems. That's number 41. Now, solar hot waters have been in technology that's been around a real long time, and it works really well to heat water. What's happened actually in the U.S. is because of photovoltaic systems and also heat pumps, it's not continuing to grow as quickly. But in most of the rest of the world, the first thing that people want to do is they want to have some hot water, and they can plunk down a couple of solar thermal panels and, a little bit of electricity, and those systems can generate the hot water they need for bathing and cooking. So that's good. That's number 41. Number 42, right after that, are heat pumps. I think solar hot water's got some growth, but not incredible, whereas heat pumps, number 42, that goes into buildings and city energy use. Heat pumps are really taken off, gotten way more efficient. They got way cheaper. And because we have cheap electricity, using that electricity for heating and cooling is actually something practical, as opposed to, we used to just have coal, and then we had oil, and then we had natural gas to heat up a building. Now we can heat that building with a heat pump, and the electricity for that is also produced from renewable sources. So that's got a lot of potential there. Let's see what else. Oh, all right. So a couple more. Energy storage, both for distributed and for utilities. So this is kind of towards the bottom of the list. Number 77, energy storage for distributed generation. That's, each building putting it in. They don't really have costs and savings for that yet. And then just right next to it, number 70, it's actually number 77 also, is energy storage for utilities. They're kind of lumping energy storage for distributed generation, that's customer-owned, utilities, and also grid flexibility. They kind of have all that towards the bottom of the list. Got a tremendous amount of potential. They haven't really figured out what the savings and the costs are going to be for that, but it's on the list. Okay. Now, we talked about some of the ones that are like, you might have heard of that are kind of obvious. Got some wacko ones. I'm not really wacko, but so things that you wouldn't expect. Clean cook stoves. 40% of humanity cook with wood, charcoal, dung, or coal. Almost all the rest by fossil fuels. Now you can burn those things more efficiently, but more significantly, we can start using electricity for those stoves. Induction stoves are really terrific. Number 24, improved rice cultivation. Boy, that one surprised me. Rice is a staple of half the world's population. It's 1/5 of the calories consumed by humanity. But unfortunately, it creates 10% of the greenhouse gases from agriculture because rice paddies produce methane as the plants decompose. By doing it better, we can save. Number 36, alternative cement. Now, cement manufacturing is 5% of global emissions. So cement is the main ingredient in concrete. Basically, you take cement, you mix it with sand or rocks, and you get concrete. There's a bunch of new techniques to reduce the emissions in concrete and cement manufacturing, so that's significant. 55 and 56, household recycling and industrial recycling. Yeah, they're on the list because it's fundamentally, it uses a lot less energy to reuse materials than produce new ones. And the last one is on the list is high-speed rail transport. Good idea. Very costly and very tough policy. So some economies, like in China, they can kind of get those through pretty quickly. But a lot of times in the U.S., there's so many competing interests and so many costs to that these things they're just not happening. All right. It's just kind of wrapping up conclusions. We've got a practical roadmap for these solutions. Obviously, it's very expensive and it's going to take a long time, but the savings are clearly greater than the cost. Now, my personal opinion, we're going to have to live with global warming, for our foreseeable lifetimes. It's not clear to me, unfortunately, that we can immediately reverse the situation. So we got to try everything. But I am very encouraged by progress in some areas, particularly the areas that are most obviously economically beneficial. Because if the economics are good, there's going to be new industries cropping up like solar, like wind, like plant-based foods that are really kind of taking off. And that's popular. The ones that are going to really require changes to the way that our political system is designed or our society, the way we live, that's going to be really tough. All right. That's all the time we have on this week's Energy Show. Thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. And if you miss any of today's show, you can always go to our website at cinnamon.energy and listen to the podcast.
So, you want to save the world with clean energy? Make money doing it? Confused about the economic and technical realities of residential and commercial solar, batteries, heat pumps, EVs? Want the real-world scoop on new energy technologies, not manufacturer hype? Then tune in to the weekly Energy Show, hosted by Barry Cinnamon. Insights from Barry's 40-plus years in the solar and energy industry will help you understand the future ways we'll generate and consume energy. And now, here's Barry.